I've investigated a lot of cheating spouses in my 5 years as a private investigator, but David Collins was the first client who hired me to prove his wife was planning to kill him. And he was the first client who was absolutely right. My name is Riley Hunt, and this is the story of how a man who lost everything twice decided to die once to save what was left of his life. It started on a Wednesday morning in September, when Miami's summer heat was finally beginning to loosen its stranglehold on the city. The humidity still clung to everything like guilty secrets, but there was something in the air that suggested change was coming. I should have paid more attention to that feeling. David Collins walked into my office at exactly 9 a.m., which told me two things immediately. He was punctual, and he was desperate. In my experience, people who need a private investigator but can still keep appointments are either very disciplined or very scared. David Collins turned out to be both. He was 55 years old with silver hair that had been expensively styled to look casual and a suit that cost more than most people make in a month. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They had the haunted look of a man who'd been betrayed before and was watching it happen again in slow motion. "Mr. Hunt," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of someone who'd learned not to trust his surroundings. "I need you to investigate my wife, but not for the reasons you might think." Carmen Rodriguez, my assistant and the smartest person in the room on most days, brought us coffee and quietly activated the recording equipment. She'd been with me for 3 years, ever since her husband died, and left her needing work that paid better than hospital administration. Carmen had an instinct for reading people that rivaled my own, and I watched her study David Collins with the focused attention she reserved for potentially dangerous clients. "What reasons should I be thinking about, Mr. Collins?" I asked. David pulled out a manila folder and placed it on my desk with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. "Most men hire you to prove their wives are cheating. I want you to prove my wife is planning to murder me." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. In Miami's private investigation business, you heard a lot of crazy theories from paranoid spouses, but something about David Collins's tone suggested this wasn't paranoia. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Collins. What makes you think your wife wants to kill you?" David opened the folder and pulled out a life insurance policy. The beneficiary was Alyssa Collins, his wife of 2 years. The payout was $15 million. "I never agreed to this policy," David said. "Alyssa had it drawn up 6 months ago and forged my signature. I only discovered it last week when my accountant was reviewing our insurance portfolio." I examined the policy documents. The signature looked legitimate to my untrained eye, but more importantly, the policy had been approved and was currently active. If David Collins died, his wife would receive $15 million tax-free. "Mr. Collins, insurance fraud is a federal crime. If your wife forged your signature, you should contact the FBI, not a private investigator." "Mr. Hunt, I've been married twice. My first wife, Caroline, spent 20 years slowly destroying me financially and emotionally before I finally divorced her. It cost me $40 million and half my business to get rid of her." David's voice carried the weight of old pain. "I swore I'd never let another woman do that to me, but somehow I did it again." David pulled out a second document, a prenuptial agreement that heavily favored him in case of divorce. Under the terms of the prenup, Alyssa would receive a modest settlement if their marriage ended, but nothing approaching the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to as his wife. "You see the problem, Mr. Hunt. If Alyssa divorces me, she gets almost nothing. But if I die, she gets $15 million, plus whatever she can claim from my estate. From her perspective, I'm worth more dead than alive." The logic was sound, but it was also the kind of logic that led to paranoid husbands hiring private investigators to follow faithful wives. I needed more evidence before I took the case. "What else makes you think Alyssa is planning to kill you?" David's expression darkened. "She's been encouraging me to take up dangerous hobbies." Skydiving, motorcycle racing, deep-sea fishing in rough weather. Last month, she bought me a vintage Ducati and suggested I take it on weekend rides through the Keys. She's also been asking detailed questions about my business travel schedule and whether I ever travel alone. That could be innocent, Mr. Collins. Maybe she's trying to encourage you to live more adventurously. Maybe. But there's something else. David hesitated, as if he wasn't sure he should continue. I think Alyssa is having an affair? That got my attention. Unfaithful wives who stood to inherit millions from their husbands' deaths were a dangerous combination. If Alyssa Collins was planning her husband's murder, an affair would provide both emotional motivation and practical assistance. What makes you think she's cheating? She's been going to the gym 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. She claims she's training for a marathon, but I've never seen her run anywhere except on the treadmill. She's also been receiving mysterious phone calls that she takes in private, and she started carrying a second cell phone that she thinks I don't know about. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a check for $10,000. Mr. Hunt, I want you to follow my wife and document everything she does. If she's planning to kill me, I want evidence. If she's just cheating, I want to know that too. Either way, I need to know what I'm dealing with before it's too late. I studied David Collins for a long moment, trying to read the man behind the expensive suit and haunted eyes. In my experience, paranoid husbands were usually paranoid for good reason, but they were also unreliable witnesses to their own marriages. David's story was plausible, but it was also exactly the kind of story that a controlling husband might invent to justify investigating his wife. But there was something about the insurance policy that bothered me. $15 million was enough money to motivate murder, and forged signatures on legal documents suggested planning and premeditation rather than spontaneous infidelity. Mr. Collins, I'll take your case. My daily rate is $500 plus expenses, but I need you to understand that if I find evidence that your wife is planning to commit a crime, I'll have to report it to law enforcement. That's exactly what I want you to do, Mr. Hunt. I don't want to be married to a woman who's planning to kill me, but I also don't want to end up dead because I was too proud to ask for help. After David left, I sat in my office reviewing what he'd told me and trying to decide whether I was dealing with a genuinely threatened man or a paranoid husband with too much money and not enough trust. The insurance policy was real, and $15 million was certainly enough to motivate murder. But forged signatures and suspicious behavior could also be explained by a woman who was planning to leave her husband and wanted to secure her financial future. The case reminded me of my own marriage to Sarah, which had ended 2 years earlier when I discovered she was having an affair with a colleague at her law firm. Like David, I'd ignored the warning signs, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in going to the gym. Like David, I'd been too trusting or too stupid to see what was happening until it was too late. The difference was that Sarah had wanted to divorce me, not kill me. But in some ways, the emotional damage had been the same. She'd taken half my savings, most of my self-respect, and all of my ability to trust women who said they loved me. Watching David Collins describe his suspicions about his wife was like looking into a mirror that reflected my own fears about relationships and betrayal. Carmen appeared in my doorway with a fresh cup of coffee and the look she got when she'd been thinking about something important. "What did you think of our client?" I asked. "Scared, angry, and probably right about his wife," Carmen said. "But there's something else. He's not telling us everything. There's more to this story than just a cheating wife and a forged insurance policy." "What makes you say that?" 23 years of marriage, 3 divorces, and 15 years working in hospitals. I know what people look like when they're lying, and I know what they look like when they're scared. David Collins is scared, but he's not surprised. Whatever his wife is planning, he's been expecting it. Carmen's observation was astute, as usual, David Collins had been calm and organized when describing his wife's suspicious behavior, more like someone confirming suspicions than someone discovering betrayal. That suggested either paranoid surveillance of his wife or advanced knowledge of her plans. "Carmen, I need you to run full background checks on David and Alyssa Collins. Financial records, marriage history, criminal background, social media presence, and see what you can find about their prenuptial agreement and any other legal documents." "You got it. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if Alyssa Collins is planning to murder her husband for money, she's not the first woman to come up with that idea. And if David Collins has been married to 2 women who betrayed him, he's either very unlucky or very bad at choosing partners." The next morning I began surveillance of Alyssa Collins. According to the information David had provided, she typically left their house in Coral Gables around 10 a.m. for her daily workout at an exclusive fitness club in Coconut Grove. The club was the kind of place where membership cost more than most people's annual salary, and where the real business was conducted in the spa and juice bar rather than on the exercise equipment. Alyssa Collins was exactly what I'd expected from David's description: stunning, athletic, and expensively maintained. She was 34 years old but looked 10 years younger, with blonde hair that had been professionally highlighted, and a body that suggested both good genetics and serious financial investment in personal training and cosmetic procedures. But it was her behavior that caught my attention. Alyssa moved through the gym with the focused intensity of someone who was working rather than working out. She spent 20 minutes on the treadmill, 15 minutes with weights, and then disappeared into the locker room for over an hour. I positioned myself in the club's cafe where I could monitor the locker room exits without being obvious about it. What I saw confirmed David's suspicions about his wife's activities. Alyssa emerged from the women's locker room with a man who was obviously not her husband. He was younger, maybe 28 or 30, with the kind of muscular build that suggested he was either a personal trainer or someone who spent serious time working on his appearance. More importantly, their body language suggested a relationship that went far beyond professional fitness instruction. They sat together at a corner table in the cafe, leaning close and speaking in voices too low for me to hear from my position across the room. But I didn't need to hear their conversation to understand what I was seeing. The way Alyssa touched his arm, the way he looked at her mouth when she spoke, the way they both checked their phones before leaving separately. It was textbook affair behavior. I followed the man to the parking lot and noted his license plate number. A quick database search through Carmen's law enforcement contacts identified him as Jake Murphy, 28 years old, unemployed actor, and part-time personal trainer. His financial records showed the classic pattern of someone living beyond his means: credit card debt, student loans, and irregular income from temporary jobs. But what caught my attention was Jake Murphy's recent financial activity. Over the past 3 months, he'd received several large cash deposits that didn't correspond to any recorded employment. Someone had been paying Jake Murphy significant amounts of money, and based on what I'd observed at the gym, that someone was probably Alyssa Collins. I spent the rest of the week documenting Alyssa's routine and building a picture of her relationship with Jake Murphy. They met at the gym every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, always in the cafe after their workouts. They exchanged packages, sometimes small envelopes, sometimes larger items that could have contained cash or documents. And they were clearly intimate, though they were careful not to display their relationship publicly. But I also noticed something else that made me think David Collins' paranoia might be justified. Alyssa and Jake's conversations were serious, focused, and often involved them looking at documents that one or the other had brought. This wasn't just an affair. It was a business relationship disguised as an affair. The breakthrough came on the following Thursday, when I managed to position myself close enough to their table to use a directional microphone to record part of their conversation. "The insurance policy is active," Alyssa was saying, her voice carrying the tone of someone discussing a business transaction. Thomas confirmed that the payout would be processed within 30 days of the incident. "And you're sure about the timing?" Jake asked. "Because if this goes wrong, we're both fucked." "It won't go wrong. I've been planning this for months. David trusts me completely, and he's been taking more risks lately because I've been encouraging him to live more adventurously." "What about the boat trip?" "Perfect. He loves taking the yacht out on weekends, especially when the weather's rough. He thinks it makes him look adventurous and masculine. All we have to do is make sure he goes out alone during the next storm." "And I'll be there to witness the accident?" "You'll be on a fishing boat nearby. You'll see David's yacht get into trouble. You'll try to help, but you'll be too late. The Coast Guard will find the wreckage, but they won't find David's body. Shark attacks are common in those waters." The conversation continued with details that made my blood run cold. Alyssa and Jake weren't just planning to kill David Collins. They were planning to murder him in a way that would look like an accident and ensure that his body would never be found. Without a body, there would be no autopsy, no forensic evidence, and no way to prove that David's death was anything other than a tragic boating accident. But they were also planning something else that would make the murder even more profitable. After David's death, Alyssa would inherit his estate and life insurance, but she would also be free to marry Jake, who would then have access to her newfound wealth. They weren't just planning murder. They were planning a future together built on David Collins's grave. I had heard enough to confirm David's worst fears about his wife, but I had also heard enough to realize that Alyssa and Jake were planning to commit their crime very soon. I needed to contact David immediately and warn him about the danger he was in. But when I called David's office, his secretary told me he was out of town on business and wouldn't be back until the following Monday. When I called his home, Alyssa answered and told me that David was in Houston meeting with potential investors and that she didn't know how to reach him. Something about Alyssa's tone made me think she was lying. If David was really out of town on business, why hadn't he mentioned it when he hired me? And if he was worried about his wife planning to kill him, why would he leave town without telling me where he was going? I decided to drive to the Collins residence in Coral Gables and see if I could learn more about David's supposed business trip. The house was a massive Mediterranean-style mansion overlooking Biscayne Bay, with a private dock where a 60-foot yacht was moored. The yacht was named Second Chance, which struck me as either ironic or prophetic, given what I'd learned about Alyssa's plans. I positioned myself across the street and waited to see if David was really out of town or if Alyssa was lying about his whereabouts. What I saw over the next 2 hours convinced me that something was very wrong with the situation. Alyssa left the house at 2 p.m. and drove to a marina in Key Biscayne, where she met with a man I didn't recognize. He was older than Jake Murphy, maybe 45 or 50, with the kind of weathered appearance that suggested he worked on or around boats. They talked for about 30 minutes, exchanged what appeared to be money for documents, and then parted ways. I followed the man to a marina office where he was apparently employed as a boat mechanic or marina supervisor. A quick check of the marina's employee records identified him as Carlos Mendez, a marine engineer with a reputation for being able to fix or modify any kind of boat equipment. The implications were disturbing. If Alyssa was meeting with boat mechanics and discussing modifications or repairs, she might be planning to sabotage David's yacht to ensure that his accident would be fatal. A properly sabotaged boat would sink quickly and leave no evidence of tampering, especially if the sabotage was designed to look like mechanical failure. But there was something else that bothered me about what I'd observed. Alyssa had been calm and businesslike during her meeting with Carlos Mendez, more like someone arranging routine boat maintenance than someone planning her husband's murder. That suggested either remarkable composure or extensive experience with criminal activity. I decided to dig deeper into Alyssa's background to see if there were any clues about her previous relationships or criminal history. What Carmen found in her research made me realize that David Collins was dealing with something much more dangerous than simple adultery. Alyssa Collins, née Porter, had been married twice before. Her first husband, Robert Porter, had died in a car accident 2 years after their wedding, leaving Alyssa with a modest life insurance payout and no children. Her second husband, Michael Stevens, had died in a boating accident 3 years later, leaving Alyssa with a much larger inheritance and a suspicious pattern of dead husbands. But it was the details of those deaths that made me think David Collins was in immediate danger. Both men had died in accidents that could have been prevented by basic safety precautions. Robert Porter hadn't been wearing a seatbelt when his car went off the road, and Michael Stevens hadn't been wearing a life jacket when his boat capsized in rough weather. Both men had also recently increased their life insurance coverage shortly before their deaths. "Carmen," I said after reviewing Alyssa's background information, "we're not dealing with a cheating wife who's planning her first murder. We're dealing with a serial killer who's been murdering husbands for money." "How many husbands has she killed?" "At least 2 that we can prove, and possibly more that we can't. David Collins isn't her victim, he's her next victim." But even as I realized the scope of the danger David was facing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the case didn't add up. David had hired me to investigate his wife's suspicious behavior, but he'd also left town at exactly the time when that behavior was becoming most dangerous. Either he was remarkably unlucky in his timing, or he knew more about Alyssa's plans than he'd admitted. I decided to find out where David had really gone and whether his business trip was genuine or an elaborate deception. What I discovered changed my understanding of everything that had happened since David Collins walked into my office. David Collins wasn't in Houston meeting with investors. According to his company's travel records, he hadn't left Miami at all. His credit cards hadn't been used outside the city, his phone hadn't connected to any cell towers outside South Florida, and his private jet was still sitting on the tarmac at Miami International Airport. David Collins was hiding somewhere in Miami, letting his wife think he was out of town while she finalized her plans to kill him. The question was whether he was hiding because he was afraid of Alyssa, or because he was planning something that required her to believe he was vulnerable. The answer came the next morning, when I followed Alyssa to another meeting that revealed the full scope of what was really happening. Alyssa drove to a small office building in downtown Miami and met with a man who identified himself as Thomas Wright, an insurance investigator. But Wright wasn't investigating insurance fraud. He was facilitating it. Over the course of their hour-long meeting, Wright provided Alyssa with detailed information about how life insurance claims were processed, what documentation would be required to claim David's $15 million policy, and how to expedite the payout to avoid lengthy investigations. But Wright also provided something else: a business card for a man named Victor Moretti, who operated what Wright described as a private club for wealthy clients who needed discretionary financial services. I recognized the address as being in an area of Miami Beach known for its underground gambling operations. "Mrs. Collins," Wright said as their meeting concluded, "Victor's establishment can provide you with short-term financing if you need immediate cash flow while the insurance claim is being processed. He's very understanding about the unique circumstances that sometimes arise in our business." After Alyssa left, I managed to get close enough to Wright to overhear him making a phone call to someone he called Mr. M. "The Collins situation is moving forward on schedule," Wright said. "The client is committed to the timeline we discussed, and all the documentation is in place. You should expect the transaction to be completed within the next 2 weeks. Wright's conversation confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Alyssa wasn't just planning to murder David Collins, she was part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in insurance fraud and murder for profit. Wright was the inside man who ensured that fraudulent claims were processed quickly, and Victor Moretti was apparently the financier who provided upfront money to clients who needed immediate cash. But I still didn't understand David's role in what was happening. Was he an innocent victim who had stumbled into a murder plot, or was he somehow involved in the scheme himself? The answer came that afternoon, when I decided to search for David at the most obvious place he might be hiding, his own office building. Collins Shipping occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Miami, with executive offices that overlooked the port where David's cargo ships loaded and unloaded containers from around the world. I expected to find the building empty or lightly staffed if David was really out of town on business. Instead, I found David Collins sitting in his private office, surrounded by computer monitors and surveillance equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything I used in my private investigation business. "Mr. Hunt," David said when his secretary showed me into his office, "I was wondering when you'd figure out where I was hiding." The office had been transformed into a command center, with screens displaying video feeds from cameras throughout David's house, audio equipment that was apparently monitoring phone conversations, and files that contained detailed information about Alyssa's activities, Jake Murphy's background, and the criminal organization that was planning David's murder. "Mr. Collins, what the hell is going on? Your wife thinks you're in Houston. I've been investigating her plan to kill you, and you've been sitting here running your own surveillance operation." David gestured for me to sit down and poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle that had apparently been getting heavy use recently. "Mr. Hunt, I hired you to investigate my wife because I needed an independent witness to document what she was planning. But I've known about Alyssa's intentions for months. I've been recording her conversations, tracking her movements, and building a case against her and her associates." "Why didn't you just go to the police?" "Because I don't just want to stop Alyssa from killing me. I want to destroy the entire organization that's been murdering men like me for profit." David's voice carried a cold anger that suggested personal stakes beyond simple self-preservation. "Mr. Hunt, Alyssa didn't choose me randomly. She was recruited to target me by the same people who arranged her previous marriages to Robert Porter and Michael Stevens." David pulled out a thick file that contained information about Victor Moretti's criminal organization. The group specialized in a sophisticated form of insurance fraud that involved recruiting attractive women to marry wealthy older men, murdering those men in fake accidents, and collecting the life insurance payouts while the women disappeared into new identities. "Alyssa has been working for this organization for at least 5 years, David continued. "She's not a serial killer who happens to be good at choosing rich husbands. She's a professional assassin who specializes in murder disguised as marriage." "How long have you known?" "I started suspecting something was wrong about 6 months after we got married. Alyssa was too perfect, too accommodating, too interested in my business and financial affairs. It reminded me of Caroline, my first wife, but Caroline had been clumsy and obvious about her gold digging. Alyssa was subtle, professional, patient." David showed me surveillance footage of Alyssa meeting with Victor Moretti at his private club, a luxurious casino operation that catered to wealthy criminals and corrupt officials. The footage showed Alyssa receiving payments, documents, and instructions for her assignment to seduce, marry, and murder David Collins. "But here's the thing, Mr. Hunt. I didn't just stumble into Alyssa's web. I walked into it deliberately, with my eyes open, because I wanted to catch the people who killed my first wife." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't been victimized twice by predatory women. He'd been hunting the organization that had killed Caroline, and he'd used himself as bait to expose their operation. "Caroline wasn't a gold digger," David explained. "She was working undercover for the FBI. Investigating Victor Moretti's organization. When they discovered her real identity, they killed her and made it look like suicide. The divorce, the financial settlement, the emotional abuse, it was all part of Caroline's cover story." David pulled out Caroline's real identification. She'd been FBI Special Agent Caroline Walsh, assigned to a task force investigating organized crime in South Florida. Her supposed suicide had actually been murder, but the FBI hadn't been able to prove it because the evidence had been destroyed and the witnesses had disappeared. After Caroline died, I spent 2 years building my own case against Moretti's organization. I used my business connections to identify their targets. I hired private investigators to document their methods, and I waited for them to come after me so I could catch them in the act. That's why you hired me. I needed an independent investigator to document Alyssa's activities and provide testimony that couldn't be dismissed as revenge or paranoia. You've been gathering evidence that will help convict not just Alyssa and Jake Murphy, but the entire network of people who've been murdering wealthy men throughout Florida. David's plan was brilliant, but it was also incredibly dangerous. He was allowing his wife to proceed with her plan to murder him while secretly documenting every aspect of the conspiracy. But if something went wrong, if Alyssa changed her timeline or her methods, David could end up dead despite all his preparation. "Mr. Collins, this is insane. You're risking your life to catch criminals that the FBI should be investigating." "The FBI tried to investigate them and failed. Caroline died because the organization has connections in law enforcement, the court system, and the insurance industry. They've been operating for at least 10 years, and they've killed at least 20 men that we can identify." David showed me a wall chart that mapped the organization's activities across Florida. Victor Moretti was the financier and operations coordinator. Thomas Wright and several other insurance investigators expedited fraudulent claims. A network of lawyers, judges, and law enforcement officials provided legal protection. And women like Alyssa carried out the actual murders. "But we're going to stop them, Mr. Hunt. Tomorrow night, Alyssa thinks I'm going to take the yacht out for a sunset cruise. She's arranged for Jake Murphy to be nearby in a fishing boat, ready to witness my tragic accident. What she doesn't know is that I've prepared a different kind of accident, one that will expose her and her associates instead of killing me." David's counterplan was as elaborate as Alyssa's murder scheme. He would fake his own death during the yacht trip, while hidden cameras recorded Alyssa and Jake's reaction to his supposed drowning. Coast Guard vessels equipped with FBI agents would witness the staged accident and arrest Jake Murphy when he failed to provide adequate assistance, and surveillance equipment would document Alyssa's attempts to claim the insurance money and contact her handlers. "The beauty of the plan," David explained, "is that Alyssa and Jake will confess to murder while trying to cover up what they think is an actual death. They'll provide evidence of their guilt while we document every word." But David's plan also required perfect timing, flawless execution, and a certain amount of luck. If Alyssa suspected that David was onto her scheme, she might change her methods or disappear entirely. If the weather conditions weren't right for a believable boating accident, the plan would have to be postponed. And if something went wrong during the staged death, David could end up actually drowning while trying to fake his own murder. "Mr. Collins, what if Alyssa doesn't react the way you expect? What if she's more suspicious or more cautious than you think? Then we'll have documented evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, even if we can't prove attempted murder." "But, Mr. Hunt, I've been watching Alyssa for months. She's confident, professional, and completely convinced that I'm an easy target. She won't suspect that I'm setting a trap until it's too late." I spent the rest of that day helping David finalize his preparations for the staged boating accident. The plan was complex enough to require multiple backup systems and contingency protocols, but it was also simple enough to be believable as an actual accident. David would take his yacht out at sunset, as he often did on weekend evenings. He would disable the boat's safety equipment and radio, making it appear that mechanical failures had left him stranded in rough water. He would then use scuba equipment to swim to a Coast Guard vessel that would be waiting nearby, while explosive charges made it appear that his yacht had suffered catastrophic damage and sunk. Jake Murphy, watching from his fishing boat, would see David's yacht explode and sink without any sign of survivors. He would report the accident to the Coast Guard, who would conduct a search that would find debris but no body. Within hours, David Collins would be presumed dead, and Alyssa would begin the process of claiming her $15 million inheritance. But hidden cameras throughout the Collins house would record Alyssa's private reaction to the news of David's death. Audio surveillance would capture her conversations with Jake Murphy, Victor Moretti, and Thomas Wright. And financial monitoring would document her attempts to claim the insurance money and launder the proceeds through Moretti's criminal organization. The key to the whole operation, David explained, is that Alyssa has to believe I'm really dead long enough for her to incriminate herself. Once she starts claiming the insurance money and celebrating my death, we'll have all the evidence we need to prosecute her and her associates. But David's plan also revealed something about his psychological state that made me worry about his judgment. He'd spent 2 years planning an elaborate revenge against the organization that had killed his wife, and he was willing to risk his own life to achieve that revenge. That suggested either remarkable courage or dangerous obsession. As I listened to David describe his plan for faking his own death, I couldn't help thinking about my own desire for revenge against Sarah and her lawyer boyfriend. After our divorce, I'd fantasized about exposing their affair to their law firm partners, or finding evidence of legal malpractice, or somehow making them pay for the way they'd destroyed our marriage. But I'd never been brave enough or crazy enough to actually pursue those fantasies. David Collins was pursuing his fantasies with the methodical precision of someone who'd turned grief into a weapon. I admired his determination, but I also worried that his need for revenge might lead him to take risks that would get him killed for real. The next evening I positioned myself at a marina near Key Biscayne, where I could observe the beginning of David's elaborate deception. The weather was perfect for a boating accident. Overcast skies, choppy water, and a storm front moving in from the Atlantic that would provide cover for the Coast Guard vessels that were standing by to assist with David's staged death. At exactly 6 p.m., David's yacht, Second Chance, left its dock and headed toward open water. I could see David on the bridge, looking like a man enjoying a peaceful evening cruise. What I couldn't see was the scuba equipment he'd hidden below deck, or the Coast Guard vessels that were waiting beyond the horizon, or the explosive charges that would simulate catastrophic engine failure. 20 minutes later, Jake Murphy left the marina in a rented fishing boat, following David's yacht at a distance that would allow him to witness the planned accident without being close enough to provide actual assistance. Jake looked nervous but determined, like an actor preparing for the most important performance of his life. Using binoculars, I tracked both boats as they moved into the area where David's accident was supposed to occur. The timing had to be perfect. David needed enough time to escape from his yacht before the explosions, but Jake needed to see what appeared to be a catastrophic accident that left no possibility of survival. At 6:47 p.m., David's yacht suddenly erupted in a fireball that could be seen from several miles away. Even though I knew the explosion was staged, the sight was terrifying. A 60-foot yacht being destroyed in seconds by what appeared to be massive engine explosions. Through my binoculars, I could see Jake Murphy's fishing boat racing toward the burning wreckage, but arriving too late to save anyone who might have survived the initial explosion. I could also see Coast Guard vessels approaching from different directions, beginning a search and rescue operation that they knew would find debris, but no survivors. What I couldn't see was David Collins swimming underwater toward the Coast Guard vessel that was waiting to pick him up. According to the plan, he would remain hidden until Alyssa had provided enough evidence to incriminate herself and her associates. But I could see Jake Murphy's reaction as he circled the burning wreckage of David's yacht, and his behavior confirmed that he genuinely believed he'd just witnessed a fatal accident. He looked shocked, horrified, and relieved, the perfect reaction of someone who'd planned a murder and watched it succeed. Jake's radio call to the Coast Guard was captured by surveillance equipment, and his voice carried the tone of someone reporting a genuine emergency. Coast Guard, this is fishing vessel Lucky Strike. I just witnessed a massive explosion on a yacht about 2 miles southeast of Stiltsville. The boat is completely destroyed. I don't see any survivors. The Coast Guard response was immediate and professional, with multiple vessels converging on the accident site to conduct search and rescue operations. But the search was carefully orchestrated to find evidence of David's death without actually finding David, who was safe aboard a Coast Guard vessel that was officially searching a different area. Within 2 hours, the Coast Guard had recovered enough debris from David's yacht to confirm that it had suffered catastrophic damage and sunk in deep water. They'd also found personal items, David's wallet, his watch, a life jacket, that suggested he'd been aboard when the explosion occurred. What they hadn't found and wouldn't find was David's body. The official Coast Guard report would list David Collins as missing and presumed dead, the victim of a tragic boating accident that had left no survivors. But hidden surveillance equipment was already documenting Alyssa Collins's reaction to the news of her husband's death. I drove back to the Collins residence in Coral Gables and positioned myself where I could observe Alyssa's behavior when she received word of David's accident. According to the plan, she would be contacted by the Coast Guard within a few hours and informed that her husband was missing and presumed dead. What I saw through the living room windows was a woman who was prepared for bad news. Alyssa had dressed in dark clothes, removed her jewelry, and arranged herself in the kind of pose that suggested grief and shock. When the Coast Guard officer arrived at her door at 10:30 p.m., Alyssa's reaction was perfect. She collapsed in apparent shock, demanded details about the search for survivors, and insisted that David must still be alive somewhere. But hidden cameras inside the house captured a different reaction once the Coast Guard officer left. As soon as Alyssa was alone, her demeanor changed completely. The grief and shock disappeared, replaced by relief and satisfaction. She poured herself a glass of champagne, called Jake Murphy to confirm that he'd successfully witnessed the accident, and began making phone calls to people who were apparently part of her criminal organization. "It's done," I heard her say during a call to someone she addressed as Mr. M., presumably Victor Moretti. David's yacht exploded during his evening cruise. There were no survivors, and the Coast Guard has called off the search. The insurance claim can be filed on Monday. Alyssa's phone calls continued throughout the night as she coordinated with Thomas Wright about expediting the insurance claim, with Victor Moretti about managing the financial proceeds, and with Jake Murphy about maintaining their cover story during the inevitable investigation. But the most incriminating conversation was a video call with someone who appeared to be another woman involved in the organization. "How did it feel?" the other woman asked. "Easier than the others," Alyssa replied. "David was so trusting, so eager to please. He never suspected that I was planning to kill him. It's almost sad. He really thought I loved him." "Any regrets?" "Only that I can't kill him again. He was actually a decent man, better than Robert or Michael. But $15 million is $15 million. The recordings captured by David's surveillance equipment provided overwhelming evidence that Alyssa had planned her husband's murder, had coordinated with criminal associates to carry out the crime, and was now preparing to profit from what she believed was a successful assassination. But David's plan required one more phase before the evidence could be used to prosecute Alyssa and her associates. She had to actually file the insurance claim and begin spending the money, providing additional proof of her criminal intentions and her membership in Victor Moretti's organization. Over the next week, I monitored Alyssa's activities as she played the role of grieving widow while secretly celebrating her criminal success. She met with lawyers about probating David's will, with insurance investigators about expediting the claim, and with financial advisors about managing her expected windfall. But she also met with Victor Moretti at his underground casino, where she received what appeared to be an advance payment against her expected insurance settlement. The meeting was captured by surveillance equipment that David had arranged to have installed in Moretti's establishment, providing evidence that linked Alyssa's insurance fraud to a larger criminal organization. "Mrs. Collins," Moretti said during their meeting, "you've done excellent work. The David Collins assignment was one of our most challenging, but you handled it with complete professionalism." "Thank you, Mr. Moretti. When will I receive my full payment?" "As soon as the insurance claim is processed and the money is transferred to our accounts. Thomas Wright estimates 2 to 3 weeks for complete clearance. In the meantime, here's $500,000 to cover your immediate expenses." Moretti handed Alyssa a briefcase full of cash, while surveillance cameras recorded the transaction and audio equipment captured their conversation about past murders and future assignments. "Are you ready for your next assignment?" Moretti asked. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a retired judge in Tampa who's worth about $30 million. His wife died last year, and he's been lonely enough to be receptive to the right kind of companionship. We think you'd be perfect for the assignment." Alyssa's willingness to discuss future murders provided additional evidence that she was a professional killer rather than a woman who had murdered her husband in a moment of passion or desperation. She was part of an organized conspiracy that had been killing wealthy men throughout Florida, and she was already planning her next victim. But Alyssa was also becoming careless in her confidence. She'd begun spending money lavishly, buying expensive clothes and jewelry, and making plans for a luxury vacation that would have been inappropriate for a recent widow. Her behavior was attracting attention from David's business associates and social circle, who found her apparent lack of grief suspicious. More dangerously, Jake Murphy was beginning to have second thoughts about their crime. The reality of having witnessed what he thought was a man's death was affecting him more than he'd expected, and he was drinking heavily and talking recklessly about what they'd done. "I keep seeing the explosion," Jake told Alyssa during a conversation that was captured by surveillance equipment. "I keep thinking about David burning alive in that boat. What if he suffered? What if he was conscious when the fire started?" "Jake, you need to get control of yourself. David's death was quick and painless, and it was necessary for our future together. You can't start falling apart now, when we're so close to having everything we wanted. I don't know if I can do this again. The Tampa assignment, I don't think I can watch another man die." "You won't have to watch if you don't want to." "But Jake, you're part of this organization now." "Mr. Moretti doesn't allow people to retire once they've proven themselves. You're either useful to him or you're a liability, and he deals with liabilities permanently." Jake's growing instability posed a threat to David's plan because unstable criminals were unpredictable criminals. If Jake decided to confess or flee, he might expose the entire operation before law enforcement could gather enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved. But Jake's emotional crisis also provided an opportunity to gather additional evidence. His guilt and fear were making him talkative, and surveillance equipment was capturing detailed confessions about the organization's methods, leadership, and previous crimes. 2 weeks after David's staged death, Alyssa received notification that her insurance claim had been approved and that $15 million would be transferred to her account within 48 hours. The speed of the approval confirmed that Thomas Wright and his associates had expedited the process in exchange for their share of the proceeds. But the insurance payment also triggered the final phase of David's plan. As soon as the money was transferred, law enforcement would have proof that Alyssa had successfully defrauded an insurance company through murder. Combined with the surveillance evidence of her planning and celebration, the financial transaction would provide overwhelming proof of her guilt. On a Thursday morning in October, exactly 3 weeks after David's staged death, Alyssa Collins received $15 million in life insurance proceeds. Within hours, she'd transferred portions of the money to accounts controlled by Victor Moretti, Thomas Wright, and Jake Murphy. providing a complete financial trail of the criminal conspiracy. But she'd also made a mistake that would prove to be her downfall. In her excitement about finally receiving the insurance money, Alyssa had called David's business partner to gloat about her inheritance and to suggest that David's death might have been a blessing in disguise for everyone involved. David was getting older and more conservative, Alyssa told Richard Martinez, David's longtime friend and business partner. Maybe now the company can pursue some of the more aggressive opportunities that David was too cautious to consider. Richard Martinez had known David for 20 years, and he found Alyssa's attitude disturbing enough to contact law enforcement. His call triggered a formal investigation into David's death and Alyssa's insurance claim, providing the legal framework for law enforcement to act on the evidence that David had been gathering. That afternoon, FBI agents executing search warrants simultaneously raided Alyssa's house, Victor Moretti's casino, Thomas Wright's office, and Jake Murphy's apartment. The coordinated operation captured all the major players in the conspiracy before they could destroy evidence or flee the country. But the most dramatic moment came when FBI agents searching Alyssa's house discovered that David Collins was still alive and hiding in a safe room that had been constructed specifically for his protection during the investigation. "Mrs. Collins," the lead FBI agent said as Alyssa was being handcuffed, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and racketeering. Your husband would like to have a word with you." David emerged from his hiding place, wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing when his yacht exploded 3 weeks earlier. He looked thinner and tired, but he was unmistakably alive and eager to confront the woman who had tried to kill him. "Hello, Alyssa," David said. "I trust you've enjoyed spending my life insurance money?" Alyssa's reaction was everything David had hoped for: shock, rage, disbelief, and finally, grudging admiration for the complexity of his deception. "You son of a bitch," she said. "You've been alive this whole time? You let me think I'd killed you?" "I let you prove that you wanted to kill me. There's a difference." The FBI agents found evidence throughout Alyssa's house that documented her involvement in David's planned murder and her connections to Victor Moretti's criminal organization. But they also found evidence of her involvement in the deaths of her previous husbands, providing proof that she was a serial killer who had been murdering wealthy men for years. Jake Murphy's arrest was equally dramatic, but for different reasons. When FBI agents found him in his apartment, he was drunk, suicidal, and eager to confess to everything he'd done. His guilt over what he thought was David's death had broken him psychologically, and he provided detailed information about the organization's methods and previous crimes. "I've been seeing David's face every night for 3 weeks, Jake told the FBI agents. "I keep hearing the explosion, keep seeing the fire. I can't live with what we did to him." When the agents informed Jake that David was still alive, his relief was so intense that he collapsed and had to be hospitalized for exhaustion and dehydration. But his willingness to cooperate provided crucial testimony about the conspiracy and the roles of various participants. Victor Moretti's arrest was the most significant from a law enforcement perspective because his criminal organization had been responsible for dozens of murders throughout Florida and other states. The evidence gathered during David's investigation provided the foundation for prosecuting a conspiracy that had been operating for more than a decade. Thomas Wright's arrest exposed corruption within the insurance industry that had allowed fraudulent claims to be processed quickly and without adequate investigation. His cooperation with the conspiracy had enabled multiple murders and had cost insurance companies millions of dollars in fraudulent payouts. But perhaps the most satisfying arrest, from David's perspective, was that of the people who had killed his first wife. The evidence gathered during his undercover operation provided proof that Caroline Walsh had been murdered by Moretti's organization, and several people were charged with her death. The trials of Alyssa Collins, Victor Moretti, and their associates were among the most sensational criminal prosecutions in Miami's recent history. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions were detailed, and the financial records provided a clear trail of conspiracy and fraud. Alyssa was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and the murders of her 2 previous husbands. She was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. During her sentencing, she showed no remorse for her crimes and blamed David for entrapping her in his elaborate investigation. "David Collins is not a victim," Alyssa told the court. "He's a manipulator who destroyed my life for his own revenge. I may have planned to kill him, but he actually did kill me. He killed the person I was trying to become." Victor Moretti was convicted of multiple murders, racketeering, and operating a criminal enterprise. He was sentenced to death and is currently on death row. The dismantling of his organization prevented numerous planned murders and saved the lives of wealthy men throughout the Southeast. Jake Murphy was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, but received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation with law enforcement. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and has become an advocate for crime victims' rights. Thomas Wright was convicted of insurance fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the insurance companies he had defrauded. But perhaps the most important outcome of the case was the systematic changes it brought to how insurance companies investigate suspicious claims and how law enforcement agencies coordinate investigations of organized crime. The case also changed my own perspective on relationships, trust, and the difference between paranoia and prudent caution. Watching David Collins risk his life to expose his wife's betrayal made me realize that my own divorce from Sarah, while painful, had been relatively simple and honest. Sarah had wanted to end our marriage, not end my life. But David's case also showed me something about the power of patience, planning, and strategic thinking. Instead of simply divorcing Alyssa or reporting his suspicions to police, David had turned his wife's murder plot into a tool for destroying an entire criminal organization. His revenge had been both personal and purposeful. 6 months after the trials concluded, I met with David Collins to discuss how the case had affected both our lives. He looked healthier and more relaxed than he had during the investigation, but he also seemed older and more careful about trusting people. "Mr. Hunt," David said during our meeting, "I want to thank you for your help with the investigation. Your independent documentation of Alyssa's activities was crucial for the prosecution. How are you dealing with everything that happened?" "Better than I expected. I thought I'd feel more satisfaction about getting revenge against the people who killed Caroline, but mostly I just feel relieved that it's over." David had used his experience to establish a foundation that provided support for victims of organized crime and insurance fraud. He'd also become an advocate for better coordination between law enforcement agencies and private investigators in cases involving complex criminal conspiracies. "The most important thing I learned," David reflected, "is that revenge is a dish best served systematically. I could have hired a hitman to kill Alyssa and Victor Moretti, but that wouldn't have saved other potential victims or prevented future crimes. By documenting their conspiracy and working with law enforcement, we were able to destroy an entire criminal organization." "Do you ever regret the way you handled the situation?" "I regret that I had to deceive so many people, including you, to make the plan work. But I don't regret stopping Alyssa and her associates from killing more innocent people." David had also found personal happiness that had eluded him during his marriages to Caroline and Alyssa. He was dating a woman named Elena Rodriguez, a federal prosecutor who had worked on the case against Moretti's organization. Their relationship was based on honesty, shared values, and mutual respect, rather than deception and financial manipulation. "Elena knows everything about my past and my investigation," David told me. "She knows about Caroline's real identity, about my plan to fake my own death, about my need for revenge against the people who destroyed my first marriage, and she accepts all of it because she understands that sometimes good people have to do dangerous things to stop evil people." The Collins case also had a significant impact on my own private investigation business. The success of our collaboration with law enforcement brought us national attention and referrals from other agencies that were investigating organized crime. Carmen and I had become specialists in cases involving insurance fraud and murder conspiracies. "Riley," Carmen said as we discussed our future plans, "the Collins case showed us that private investigators can play a crucial role in exposing crimes that are too complex for traditional law enforcement approaches. We should consider specializing in cases involving organized crime and financial fraud. But the case had also taught me something about the personal costs of seeking justice and revenge. David Collins had achieved his goals and destroyed his enemies, but he'd also spent 2 years living in constant danger and deception. His victory had been complete, but it had also been exhausting. As I reflected on the case, I realized that David's story was ultimately about the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. Alyssa, Jake, and their associates had seen David as an easy target, a wealthy older man who could be manipulated and murdered for profit. But David had refused to be a victim, even when that meant putting himself in mortal danger. The case had also taught me something about the importance of patience and planning in both investigating crimes and seeking justice. David's elaborate deception had taken months to execute, but it had resulted in the prosecution of an entire criminal organization rather than just the punishment of individual criminals. 3 years after David's staged death, I received a wedding invitation that reminded me of how the case had changed everyone involved. David Collins was marrying Elena Rodriguez in a ceremony that would be attended by law enforcement officers, federal prosecutors, and crime victims who had been helped by David's foundation. The wedding was held at David's estate in Coral Gables, on the same property where Alyssa had planned his murder. But the house had been renovated and redecorated, transforming it from a crime scene into a celebration of survival and new beginnings. "Mr. Hunt," David said during the reception, "I want you to know that working with you taught me something important about the difference between seeking revenge and seeking justice. Revenge is personal and ultimately destructive. Justice is universal and ultimately constructive. What's the difference? Revenge would have been killing Alyssa and her associates and walking away. Justice was exposing their crimes, saving future victims, and using the experience to help other people who've been targeted by similar criminals." Elena Rodriguez had become David's partner in both life and crime fighting. Together, they had established a foundation that provided legal and financial assistance to victims of organized crime, and they worked with law enforcement agencies to identify and prosecute criminal organizations that targeted vulnerable populations. David's experience showed us that civilians can play a crucial role in fighting organized crime, Elena explained during our conversation at the reception. But it also showed us the importance of working with law enforcement rather than trying to handle these situations alone. The wedding was attended by several FBI agents who had worked on the case, including the agent who had led the investigation into Victor Moretti's organization. Their presence was a reminder that David's success had been possible only because he'd been willing to cooperate with law enforcement rather than trying to handle the situation entirely on his own. But the most meaningful moment of the celebration was when David raised a toast to Caroline Walsh, his first wife, whose death had motivated his years-long quest for justice. "Caroline died fighting criminals who preyed on innocent people," David said. "She didn't live to see those criminals brought to justice, but her sacrifice made it possible for other people to survive and thrive. This wedding is as much a celebration of her life as it is a celebration of our future." As I drove home from David's wedding, I reflected on a case that had taught me something important about the relationship between love, betrayal, and justice. Alyssa Collins had married David intending to murder him for money, but her betrayal had ultimately led to her own destruction and the destruction of the criminal organization she served. The case had also taught me something about the importance of trust and verification in relationships. David had learned to trust Elena Rodriguez because he'd verified her character, her motivations, and her commitment to justice. His relationship with Elena was based on knowledge rather than hope, which made it stronger and safer than his marriages to Caroline and Alyssa. But perhaps the most important lesson of the case was that sometimes the best way to deal with people who want to destroy you is to let them think they're succeeding while you gather the evidence needed to destroy them instead. 5 years after David's staged death, our private investigation firm had become one of the most respected in Florida, specializing in cases involving organized crime, insurance fraud, and complex criminal conspiracies. We worked regularly with law enforcement agencies and had helped prosecute dozens of criminals who had thought they were too smart or too well connected to be caught. But we also learned that criminal organizations like Victor Moretti's were constantly evolving, developing new methods and recruiting new participants. The fight against organized crime was ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation from both law enforcement and private investigators. The Collins case was just the beginning, Carmen observed during one of our quarterly reviews. There are other criminal organizations out there, other Alyssa Collinses looking for wealthy targets, other Victor Moretti's running murder-for-profit schemes. Our job is to stay ahead of them and help their potential victims before it's too late. The case had also established our reputation for handling cases involving complex deceptions and long-term investigations. We'd learned that some crimes could only be solved through patience, planning, and the willingness to take calculated risks. David Collins had been willing to fake his own death to catch his wife's killers, and his success had inspired other potential victims to take proactive steps to protect themselves. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the awareness it had created about the signs of murder-for-profit schemes and the importance of seeking help when relationships seemed too good to be true. The Collins case taught us that when someone seems perfect, they might be professionally perfect, I told audiences at conferences about organized crime and financial fraud. Real people have flaws, inconsistencies, and human failings. Professional killers have been trained to appear flawless until it's too late. My name is Riley Hunt, and the David Collins case taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who promise to love you forever, and that sometimes the only way to survive a perfect marriage is to realize that perfection itself is the warning sign. As I looked out my office window at the Miami heat shimmering off the pavement, I thought about all the cases that had followed the Collins investigation, other wealthy men who'd been targeted by criminal organizations, other seemingly perfect marriages that had turned out to be murder plots, other elaborate deceptions that had required careful unraveling. But I also thought about David and Elena, who had built a relationship based on honesty rather than deception, and who had turned their shared experience with organized crime into a force for protecting other potential victims. The work never ends, but sometimes the good guys win. And sometimes, when they win, they make the world a little bit safer for everyone else. Because in the end, that's what justice really means. Not just punishing the guilty, but protecting the innocent and making sure that the predators don't get to choose their next victims. The phone rang as I finished writing my final report on the Collins case, interrupting my thoughts about the past and bringing me back to the present. "Hunt Investigations," Carmen answered. "How can we help you?" "This is Detective Martinez," the voice on the phone said. "We have a situation that might interest you. A wealthy businessman whose young wife just convinced him to increase his life insurance, and some suspicious deaths involving her previous husbands." I looked down at my shoes, well-maintained leather that had walked through crime scenes and courtrooms, through wedding receptions and funeral homes, through the complex landscape of human deception and the occasionally triumphant terrain of justice served. "We'll be right there, Detective," I said, reaching for my keys, "because the work never ends, and there's always another Alyssa Collins out there looking for another David Collins to target." But sometimes, if we're smart enough and careful enough, we can help the David Collinses of the world turn the tables on their would-be killers. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world.